Hey, this is Antonio with Enhanced Movements and Movement Code. We are going to be starting a Movement Monday that we're going to try to be bringing you guys some valuable content related to movement, rehab, chiropractic, strength and conditioning, any of those types of things on Mondays. Today we're kicking it off with squats versus deadlifts, or squats and deadlifts. And the reason why we're saying and deadlifts is we want to view these things as kind of a continuum here. So although we're highlighting the intricacies and differences of each movement, we also want to appreciate that there's a lot of overlap. And that's where I think sometimes it gets confusing for people, especially when you're looking at a movement. Now, one versus the other, we do these because we're trying to instill training a certain part of our body in a different way, although there's, again, overlapping carryover of each, especially when you're looking at different sports where you might see someone start a deadlift that looks very much like a squat pattern, but finishes like a deadlift, or vice versa. The squat looks a little bit more like a deadlift or a hip hinge. But what we want to show here is when we're looking at a squat, if this is where my hip joint is, right here, the ball and socket in our knee, we're seeing more or less maximal hip flexion and almost, not maximal, but pretty close to maximal knee flexion. Now, when we're looking at more of a deadlift or a hip hinge, we see a lot more hip flexion than we do knee flexion. Now, this is obviously proving more of the further end of the approach, which would be viewed as more like a Romanian deadlift, where there's almost like no knee bend. Traditional deadlift, you might see that knee bend more, especially as you're approaching and getting closer to the ground. But we do want to see that there are kind of carryovers between each one, especially depending on what you're trying to do. So all this comes back to, and with really any movement pattern that you're trying to do, is what's the task at hand or what's the goal? Okay, and now if we're talking about just like in class or training purposes, there's obviously much more direct indication as to what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. But when you're trying to relate each one of these things to a real world task, you're going to see a lot of this carryover. So we don't want to draw too many lines in the sand and say this is how you do this and this is how you do that, because ultimately all of this should stem back to real world tasks that we're trying to be able to complete, whether that's picking up a kid, picking up a heavy box, moving furniture, whatever that might be. You're going to see that type of carryover. Now, some of the things that we want to keep in mind related to this is kind of just how our body is wanting to operate and move based on lever systems, right? By being able to shift our weight maybe more into our heels, adding more knee or hip flexion, you're going to be able to utilize your lever systems a lot more efficiently, again, depending on what that task is. Even in your classes, as weight gets more, as the weight on the bar or whatever that might be starts to get higher, you might tend to see yourself shift in different ways to try to maximize your lever systems for you to be able to complete that task. So although we try to delineate and draw different lines demonstrating the differences between these, we do want to appreciate that there's a lot of carryover as to how they can kind of pair off of each other, again, depending on what movements we're doing. So when you are in your class or in this real world experiencing doing various tasks, just keep in mind what we're trying to actually achieve and why you're actually trying to do it, and based in the basic principles as to how to actually lift. Okay, so this is our first Movement Monday, evaluating the squats and the deadlifts. If you guys have any questions or things that you want to dive into, please feel free to shoot us a message, and we'll try to address those on future episodes or future talking points. Thanks for tuning in, and if you find this valuable and you want to share with other people, we greatly appreciate that as well. Feel free to tag us either at Enhanced Movements or at Movement Code.